This is the APUS History oral interview, and I'm interviewing my grandparents, Margaret Gray McIntyre and Donald McIntyre, and my name is Patrick Turner. Roughly what year were you born?
September the 19th, 1939.
January 4, 41.
We're in Lawrence, South Carolina now. Have both of you always lived here or in this area?
I have. I was born here and lived here all my life.
I was born in North Carolina and moved to South Carolina after the war, World War II was over.
Why did you move to Lawrence specifically?
My father lived here, and while he was in service, we lived in North Carolina with my mother's parents.
When and how did you two meet each other?
He was working for his dad across the street from where I lived, and so I met him that way. He was 13 years old when we started dating.
Is that how you remember it, Granddaddy?
Yes. She would go across the street to a grocery store, and I was at the car lot, so she had a ponytail. I think the ponytail turned me on.
What are some of your early memories of growing up during the 40s and 50s?
I grew up in, the first part was in North Carolina, and lived out in the country, and when the sun went down, it got dark, and so you didn't do too much. And I listened to the Lone Ranger on radio at 5 o'clock, and that was about it for the entertainment.
We didn't have TV, and also we played outside from the time you got up in the morning to the time you came in at night. And when the street lights came on, it was time to go home.
Mm-hmm. So you were talking about TV. Around what time did that come around or get popular, I guess?
They didn't have TV till 49, and then they had 2 channels, and then it was 4, 13, and 7. But they started, and then it was the test pattern would come on, and then the TV. So the test pattern was for adjusting the screen before it started.
And when it went off at night, it played the national anthem every night.
At 11 o'clock.
11 o'clock.
So both of you are retired now, but what were your occupations before you retired?
I was parts store owner.
And I was a school teacher.
And were you always involved in these jobs, or what were some other jobs that you worked?
I was always a teacher.
I worked at Lawrence Glass for about 8 or 9 years, and then I went in the auto parts business.
So you were in auto parts, and you owned your own store.
Yes.
What did you enjoy about being self-employed for so long?
I think the best thing was I didn't have a boss, so I ran it like I wanted to run it.
And you've always been a teacher, so what was the what was teaching and education back when you started teaching?
More parent involvement with the children, and the children respected teachers more, and they were more interested in making good grades and behaving in school. And you had the support of parents. They weren't against you, they were for you.
Going into education and as a general, what was school like back when both of you were going through the education system?
Larger classes. We would have 30 to 35 in a classroom. And the children were better behaved. The majority of them would do their work, have their homework. You had the parent involvement in helping with activities and always there to support you.
Teachers they would paddle you if you misbehaved. And there was one teacher that had a yardstick and he would use it.
So, how would you say, in addition to what the education system was like back when you were a part of it, how would you say you've seen it change over the years?
The parents aren't as supportive. They are not raising the children at home. They expected the schools to raise them and teach them and entertain them and everything else. And they're not getting as good an education as they once did because you can't teach for discipline.
Going into some major historical events, what are some of the major events that you've lived through and experienced that you can recall?
The earliest that I remember is coming in from playing and my mom telling me that Roosevelt had died, and that was in 1945.
Kennedy Assassination.
Yeah.
I know you talked about World War II earlier. What was that like growing up during wartime and all that? Yeah.
I lived in North Carolina with my grandmothers, and so I wasn't but 5 or 4, and so all I remember is when my dad came home from service.
The soldiers back then, when they left, they weren't gone. They were gone like 4 or 5 years before they returned.
They didn't get to come home.
They didn't have R&R. Once they left, they left.
Can you remember some of the specifics about the war, looking back on it now? What are some things about the war that you realize that you maybe didn't realize as a child?
One thing was D-Day, when the invasion of Normandy. How many troops got killed during the first ground? There was a lot of soldiers killed that day.
I can remember my mom having ration stamps and all. And like when we would go to the grocery store, she would have to have so many ration stamps to buy a bag of sugar or a bag of flour, and everything was rationed, gas was and all. And people were more patriotic during that war than some of the wars since then.
There wasn't any division. Everybody was for winning, and like it is now, with all the division and a lot of different people thinking different ways.
You had mostly all the men gone because they were drafted, and the women took over the men's jobs.
In factories and...
After World War II ended in 1945, some other major events happened, such as the civil rights movement. Do you remember any major events during the movement? And
I was teaching then, and my last year teaching before I stayed out with the girls was, they could come, the blacks could come to the white schools, but they had to furnish their own transportation. And we had 2 teachers, and I had 2 students in my room. But when we went to full integration, there wasn't a problem here, but the blacks did walk out of the high school and march downtown. Very peaceful, very quiet, not shouting or anything. Walked down there and stayed on the square a while and then walked back to school. But they never caused any problems or anything. But all the schools gave up a lot. They gave up their mascots, their colors, the name of their schools. And at first you had the cheerleaders, and when they'd have a pep rally, the black cheerleaders would do their cheers from their school, and then they'd alternate and the whites would do their cheers from their schools. But basically it was a very peaceful transition.
They were Kent State students got shot by the National Guard during one of the outbreaks.
do you remember ever hearing about some of the major leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr.?
Heard more about Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
Malcolm X, he was sort of a really radical, and not like Martin Luther King.
You talked about the Kennedy assassination earlier. What are some of the things you remember, like how you heard about it and what the aftermath of that was?
The Grassy Knoll was what I remember them talking about. Somebody shot him from there, but there were a lot of theories on what happened and who. Lee Harvey Oswald didn't do it. I mean, they blamed him, but that was messed up time.
I was teaching and the principal came to my room and told me that he had been shot. And Donald was in service in Texas, and a friend and myself were to fly out there for Thanksgiving weekend. And had we gone, we would have changed planes in Dallas, and they were not letting planes come in or go out. So if we'd gotten in, they wouldn't have let us out. But we had changed our mind and didn't fly out there. So.
I was in El Paso, and we were in class, and they got us out of class and said that Kennedy got killed, and there were big planes flying out from the nearby air base.
They closed the border.
Yeah, it's the only time that they've been closed, and we walked down to the border to see it locked up because you could just walk across the border until then.
You talked about the Grassy Knoll and confusion over Lee Harvey Oswald. How did I guess what were some confusion? What was some of the confusion going on during this time? Was there a lot of different stories?
Oh yeah, they were different. First was the Grassy Knoll, and then they wasn't sure how many shots was fired, and so it took a while to figure it out, I guess.
And still to this day, there's questions about it.
After Kennedy was assassinated in 1969, the moon landing occurred as another major historical event. What do you remember about that event specifically?
We were sitting here in the den watching it on TV, and a friend of ours came up and watched it with us that night. And the main thing I remember about it is them landing and putting the flag up and the comment they made.
One step for mankind. Yeah. That was good to see them land safely because it could have crashed.
What was the atmosphere like before the moon landing? How did people feel about the moon landing? Were they concerned, worried, or excited?
I think they were all excited.
Yeah, because that was a big accomplishment.
The moon landing and arms race between the U.S. and the Soviets was a major event from the end of World War II to the late 80s with the Cold War. What are some things you remember about U.S. relations with Russia, or some different events throughout that time period?
I think that's the time that the space race really started. See who'd go to the moon first.
And two, we as Americans didn't want to go into communism. So our main concern was protecting our country.
Did you ever experience any duck and cover drills, or understand the threat of nuclear warfare, I guess?
Well, a lot of people were building underground bunkers and storing food and
Fallout shelters. They probably still some of them around. Yeah.
I guess part of that nuclear warfare and nuclear threat across the world was the Cuban Missile Crisis. What do you remember about America's interactions with Cuba and events like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs invasion, stuff like that?
I just always heard that they had missiles aimed toward us and we had them aimed toward them. And if one set it off, the other one would immediately set it off, so it would destroy both of them.
That's when Kennedy backed down. Khrushchev made the ships turn around that was carrying nuclear weapons to Cuba. He really backed them down because they kept coming, and he didn't move the ships, and so that was a rough time.
Do you remember hearing anything about the Bay of Pigs invasion and how America interacted with Cuba?
The Bay of Pigs was a failed attempt for the United States to go into Cuba. I don't remember why, but they went in and then they got out. So I don't know what happened then.
You said earlier you were in service. What were the details of that?
Well, during Kennedy's assassination time.
No, when you were in service.
Oh,
Just overall.
I was in basic training in Fort Jackson, and then I went to El Paso for advanced, and then I came back home and stayed in the National Guard for 6 years.
At that time, we had the draft, and we were planning on getting married that summer. And his draft number was very low, so they couldn't guarantee us that he wouldn't be drafted before the wedding. So he joined the National Guard. And that's how he ended up in that instead of going into the service.
They had a random choosing. You had your card had a number on it, and they drew numbers, and if your number come up, you went in service.
After, or I guess still kind of during the Cold War, there was the Vietnam War ongoing. How were you involved in Vietnam or the situation?
I was in the National Guard, so I went to summer camp every year, and Vietnam was political war. They wouldn't let the pilots bomb many areas, and they just like they were there, but they didn't want to go into big combat. But there was 74,000 that died in Vietnam.
What do you remember about public reaction to Vietnam during the time, like protests?
It wasn't a popular war, and people in the United States then protested, called the soldiers baby killers, and so they spit on the soldiers when they come back home, and it wasn't their fault. And then the government sprayed Agent Orange on them, and they still, soldiers is suffering from the spraying the Agent Orange on them.
Looking back on the Vietnam War now, what are some things that you realize about it now, I guess? Or
Well, when they pulled out, they left millions of dollars worth of equipment over there and just got on the boats and pulled out and left it. And they made a lot of mistakes. The government didn't really want to get involved with the Chinese, I think is what it was.
Grandmama, do you remember anything
I
about
just mainly remember that they told the soldiers to change clothes, not wear their uniforms home, so that the Americans wouldn't realize they were soldiers from Vietnam. And they were very disrespected and mistreated. And it was a very cruel war. Some of their methods over there were so cruel.
There were some presidential and political scandals during this time, like the Watergate Scandal with Nixon and his resignation. What can you remember about that event?
They broke into the Democrat. Nixon was a Republican, and they broke into the Democrat National Headquarters to get information on the election and whatever they were looking for. And several of his administration was tried and found guilty and served some time. And then he had to resign. I think John Dean was the one I remember most that was found guilty.
What were some of the effects the aftermath of the scandal had on Americans' opinions of the presidency and political parties as a whole?
I think they had a lot of mistrust. They just didn't trust the government.
All right, we are going to take a real quick intermission. And then we'll get right back into the rest of the questions.
Fly me to the moon and let me play among the stars.
And we are back. Now, kind of getting into the modern age, in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, technology really revolutionized as an industry. And what are some of the impacts and effects you've seen coming from an era where technology is less prominent into an age where it is so prominent now?
Some of it's good, some of it's not. You go out to eat and you see a couple sitting over there eating and both of them's on the phones, they're not communicating. It's cut down on communication. You go to the bank and if the computers are down, they can't get your deposit. They'll have to mail it, the slip to you. Or you'll go in a store and they'll say, well, we can't sell it to you because our computers are down. So some of it's good, some of it's not.
The computers have revolutionized the way everybody does everyday activities. So that's one of the biggest changes. Everything, the electronics is getting smaller and more powerful, and people's not having to work hard to get things done with the computers.
But it's also, children are staying in and playing on the games and not getting outside and playing.
What are some specific technologies that you would say have had the greatest impact in, not just from the modern era, but also, like you were talking about, radio and television earlier?
TVs. We know more that's going on in the world. Back in the World War II time, the only thing you had was what little you could get off radio, and they didn't tell a lot then. Now you know everything, which is not always good, but
Robotics is biggest change is coming, I guess. There's a lot of robotics already, but there's going to be more, I think.
And when you say robotics, what?
Machines that replace humans.
they're doing, robotics are doing surgery now. And then, like BMW, they're doing assembling cars.
Painting and all.
You've lived through throughout multiple decades and seen how technology has evolved and how also music and culture has evolved as well. What are some of the ways you would say you've seen music change over the years, and
Well,
for better or for worse, I guess?
what we listen to is old school, and it's not music that comes out of a box. It's just programmed. And so I listen to old music all the time.
I listened to beach music in the 50s and country. 50s music has hung on the longest of any of it.
It stuck with you or hung on?
It just seems to have
50s.
hung on with everybody. You hear it played more than some music comes and goes now, but 50s has hung on.
Looking at the 1970s and 1980s, when Mom and Aunt Peggy were born, what was it like raising a family during these decades and this time period?
I thought it was easy to myself. But I worked and Margaret stayed home with them, and so. But I thought everything went smooth. They're good kids, I guess. I have to say that.
And back then you knew what you had to spend and not, and you stuck within that budget. And things weren't near as expensive as they are now. but you didn't make the kind of salaries then you make now.
What are some of your thoughts on past presidents of the 20th century throughout the decades, like Eisenhower in the 40s, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Reagan, Bush, etc.?
I thought Eisenhower and Kennedy, had Kennedy lived long enough, I think he would have been a great president. But Eisenhower was a good president, Kennedy was, George Bush.
So our side of the family has some ties to Lawrence in South Carolina, and you're pretty involved in tracking that family history and kind of understanding the history of the town and our family. What are some of the ways? What are some notable things about our family history that you can remember?
Well, during the Revolutionary War, one of our great-grandfathers was, his house was burned by Bloody Bill Cunningham. He was in the Army, and he came, his wife was due, she was expecting, and he came home for it. He had gotten permission to leave, and the Tories followed him home. And so Bloody Bill Cunningham, the rule was if they caught him in the house, they would hang him and leave the house. But if he wasn't in the house, they would burn the house down. So he got out and hid in the woods, and they let his wife, who had the new baby, just get a few clothes for the baby and put her out of the house and torch the house. So that's the father's back, I know. And then our family has lived here throughout the time.
What are some ways that you've continued to examine and preserve the history of our family and the town?
Just talking to people, people who have lived back or have information on family and town, and trying to get it recorded, because if we don't record it, then it's going to be gone when we're gone, and people your age is not going to know anything about it.
The museum will be a big plus in letting people learn more about Lawrence County.
I'm on the board with the museum. We have a small one, but we're now remodeling a building for a larger one.
How did you get involved with the museum and history work?
I was just asked to be on the board when it first started.
Would you say you've always been interested in history, or?
Yeah.
We're getting close to wrapping this up. What would you say your proudest achievement is for both of you?
Our girls.
And we've been lucky over the years in having finances.
Not a lot, but enough.
Is there anything else, just in general, that I didn't ask about or didn't get to that you'd like to talk about in relations to history and your memories?
We're talking about my family history. One of my great-grandfathers was in the Confederate War and died in Virginia, and they buried him up there, and his widow went up there with a buckboard wagon, and they dug him up and brought him back to Union, where she was from, and buried him over there. But my great-grandfather didn't want his son buried in Union, so he had the mortuary here to go over to Union and dig him up over there and bring him to Lawrence and bury him. So he was buried 3 times. But he's back in the family plot now here in Lawrence.
What about you, Granddaddy? Is there anything else?
No, I think that we've about wrapped it up.
And there was one extra thing I wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
You're a pretty avid collector of Coca-Cola merchandise. How did you get into collecting the merchandise?
My dad worked for the Coca-Cola plant for about 60 years. And I didn't really collect that much back then when I could have gotten it every day, but I saw it so much, I thought it would always be there. So then, and then my uncle worked there too, and my brother. And before they all died, I started collecting, and they had a bunch of stuff that they shared with me, and different people have given it to me.
All right. Well, that's all for questions I have.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for.
Wasn't as bad as I thought it would be.
Take that as a compliment.
Yes, it is.
Thank you for sharing your story and for giving your recollection of your history and relations to U.S. history as a whole.